Xbox Live. 2001 would not only mark the year of Capcom vs. SNK 2's release in arcades, but also the year that SNK declared bankruptcy. SNK collapsed on October 22, 2001 and placed the intellectual property rights for its franchises on bidding. Fortunately, SNK's original founder Eikichi Kawasaki left the company along with other executives to found the company named Playmore on August 1, 2001. They soon successfully bought up SNK's intellectual rights and many of the former SNK employees to form SNK Playmore in 2003. The same year saw the release of SNK's second crossover fighting game with Capcom, which was titled SNK vs. Capcom SVC Chaos. The gameplay was based on the King of Fighters 2002 system and featured a 4-button control scheme and one-on-one matches. Other new techniques included the front grand step, groove power gauge, and exceed moves. The game featured 36 characters from various Capcom and SNK games. Despite SNK's efforts, SVC Chaos wasn't as well received as Capcom's Versus fighting games. While the game had a great cast of characters and fans got a chance to see Capcom's characters redrawn by SNK, there were lots of other elements that made the game feel rushed. The fighting mechanics felt unrefined, the collision detection wasn't handled well, and there were play balance issues. The game was also based on the long-running Neo Geo hardware, but the sound effects felt underwhelming and the music was hardly memorable. It felt as though SNK Playmore released the game only to fulfill the rest of their contract with Capcom. Instead of reaching the wide appeal of the prior Versus games, SVC Chaos became a fighting game that only hardcore fans could appreciate. The game received a port to the Neo Geo and PlayStation 2 in 2003 and to the Xbox in 2004. One more crossover game would come from SNK, but in the form of a new collectible card game for the Nintendo DS. After the two Versus series were complete, Capcom went silent on future iterations for the Street Fighter franchise. Instead, Capcom decided to continue extending the franchise's characters into other games and other genres. For their next big crossover fighting game, Capcom decided not to focus on licensed properties but instead on its own franchises. Not only that, but it would be Capcom's second attempt at translating a typically 2D fighting game series into 3D with polygonal graphics. The game was titled Capcom Fighting All-Stars and would feature characters from Street Fighter, Final Fight, Rival Schools, and Strider. Along with the returning characters, new characters were created for the game as well. Capcom ran a limited beta test for the game in arcades, but after a lot of negative feedback from players, the game was later cancelled. What was left of Capcom Fighting All-Stars was salvaged into a new 2D fighting game titled Capcom Fighting Jam or Capcom Fighting Evolution in North America. The premise for the game was a mashup of Capcom's biggest franchises that focused on each of their specialties. The game's roster consisted of characters from Street Fighter II, Street Fighter Alpha, Street Fighter III, Darkstalkers, and Red Earth. Depending on which series the character originated from, the player would have a different fighting system available to them. The only new character was Ingrid, who originated from Capcom Fighting All-Stars. Her fighting system was based on that game's original system. The game was released in arcades in 2004 and ported to the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. Capcom Fighting Evolution was met with numerous bad reviews upon its release. Other than Ingrid, all the other characters felt like they were merely ripped from their respective fighting games but not given the proper adjustments to fit in the game. This resulted in all kinds of play balance issues, recycled graphics, sound, and mechanics. Since it was immediately compared to Capcom's other Versus games, the game's roster was incredibly underwhelming, featuring only a handful of characters from each franchise, totaling only 24 characters. So it was more than likely that many of the fan favorites weren't available at all. Midway through the game's production, the game's producer Yoshiki Okamoto decided to leave the project and was replaced by a longtime music and sound designer named Yoshinori Ono. So when Capcom Fighting Evolution became universally panned by critics and seen as a failure to Capcom, the blame was placed on Yoshinori Ono, who admitted that the crossover of the mechanics and gameplay systems from each series resulted in the game's balance issues. Despite the failure of Capcom Fighting Evolution, Capcom continued to extend their Street Fighter franchise into other video games. Those hoping for a sequel to the popular Marvel vs. Capcom 2 were disappointed to learn that after Capcom's contract with Marvel Comics expired, Marvel partnered with Electronic Arts to produce a new fighting game titled Marvel Nemesis: Rise of the Imperfects. So Capcom looked into another Japanese game company to combine their franchise characters with, and they found it with Namco. In January 2005, Namco announced that they would be partnering with Capcom in publishing Namco X Capcom for the PlayStation 2. The game was a hybrid of an action and strategy RPG. It was developed by Monolith Soft, best known at the time for the RPG series Xenosaga and Baten Kaitos. The story of the game focused on two main protagonists and an original story that was filled with cameos from Namco and Capcom franchises. Even though the game was more of an RPG, the battle screen had controls similar to that of a fighting game. Not only that, but many of the characters had the same signature moves from their original games. While Namco x Capcom wasn't a fighting game like Capcom's other crossovers, the game developed quite a following from fans that enjoyed the idea of two Japanese video game companies coming together into one dream game. The game was fun, easy to play, and paid homage to the numerous franchises on display. The question of whether Namco x Capcom would appeal to fans outside Japan eventually became a concern. It was likely that the game wouldn't interest anyone who wasn't familiar with the numerous characters from Namco's and Capcom's classic franchises. Most of its appeal would likely be only meant for older Japanese gamers who grew up with these characters. Because of these concerns, along with the heavy amount of localization required for the large volume of text and voice acting in the game, Namco x Capcom was never released outside of Japan. For a while, the only way fans outside Japan could hope to play the game was by importing it. However, a group of video game fans at Transgen got together to work on an English translation for the game. Their work resulted in an English patch that could be applied to an ISO or disk image of the game, which could then be played on a modded PS2 or a PS2 emulator on the PC. For fans of Street Fighter and its crossover fighting games, there was the freeware 2D fighting game engine known as Mugen. Designed by Electbyte, the engine was originally intended to be used for developing fighting games for the MS-DOS back in 1999. The engine allowed for up to 7 gameplay buttons, directional keys, 2 human players, enemy AI, and several options for gameplay modes. Development was switched to the Linux platform in 2001 and ultimately ceased in 2003 while a Windows version was being made. When the beta version leaked, the engine was hacked by a third party to allow anyone to create characters, background stages, and other game objects such as text, graphics, and sound. This allowed people to hack the engine even further to include characters from many existing fighting games along with many of its assets. Many fans have gone even further to design their own characters from scratch, including numerous versions of popular Street Fighter characters. The engine is now widely regarded as a heavily customizable game that allows anyone to design their own fighting game with a multitude of options to make it just the way they want it.